Most of my presentation is going to focus on rabbinic sources of a slightly later period, the 4th and 5th centuries in Roman Palestine, and then the Babylonian Talmud, which is the 7th century further to the east in Babylonia. We will, however, get to the 17th century today as well. I just want to add the point, Professor Gardner made this point yesterday also about rabbinic sources, is that it's a complex task to tease out what they have to say. These are compilations that consist of traditions that come from different times and different places. They have been edited, sometimes lightly, sometimes heavily, and it's a tremendous source and redaction critical task to tease out what they have to say. The same problem does not exist when we get to the gentlemen we'll be looking at, 2 from the Middle Ages and 2 from early modernity. One, a lesser-known Jewish scholar of the Middle Ages, Eliezer of Metz. He is lesser known, but he has a big impact, as we will see. Maimonides, who from the 12th century, who has a great impact. Then from the 16th century, we'll be looking a bit at Joseph Caro from Safed, who produces what becomes accepted as a kind of authoritative restatement of practical Jewish law. And then we'll end somewhat nearby with Prague, a scholar named Ephraim Lunschitz of Prague, who merits inclusion today because he was obsessed with our topic, he should be here. Were he alive, he should be presenting here today, but I will have to do. The presentation will focus on poverty. The written paper will include a discussion of charity. I encourage you to ask me if you have questions about it, but in the interest of time, I wanted to focus on the portrayal of the poor and aspects of the poor themselves, and not on charity. So we won't be looking quite at that today. And the categories I'll be looking at, first of all, are who are the poor, the categories of the poor. Secondly, poverty and gender. Thirdly, the lives of the poor. Fourth, the question of why is there poverty? Why are poor people poor? Fifth, theological constructions of the poor. And then the 6th section is moving into the Middle Ages and early modernity to see some of the evolution of some of these ideas. So beginning with who are the poor, I want to start with some rabbinic reflections on biblical terminology, and here I'll call your attention to the very first source on your sheet, which comes from a work called Leviticus Rabbah, a homiletical collection of expositions by rabbis of the 4th to 5th century on the book of Leviticus. And we see here that they say, and this is the rabbis reflecting on the Hebrew Bible, 7 designations, shemot, literally names, were given to the poor person. Ani, evion, miskain, that should ring a bell, rash, dal, dach, mach. And then the text takes us through it. Ani means literally poor, and I'm going to interject. Ani is the term for the poor which is most common in the Hebrew Bible. It is, in fact, the most common Hebrew term in rabbinic literature, as well as ania, the Aramaic, as well. So ani is literally poor, but then he is called evion, and then we get a fanciful etymology. Evion has nothing to do with the word in parentheses, mitaev. He longs for everything. Miskain, like masakin, in the plural in Arabic, because he is despised by all, citing Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 16. He's called Rash because he is dispossessed, mitroshesh, of all property, Dal because he is detached from property, Meduldal, Dach because he is crushed, Medugdak, he sees a thing and cannot eat it. It's very haunting. He sees a thing and cannot drink it. And Mach because he becomes like a kind of lowest threshold. The 2 points that I want to make, the one I made about Ani, which is the most ubiquitous term. The other is, of course, the miskain, which is a term which in its Aramaic form, miskana, appears in literature, rabbinic literature of the 4th to 5th century. I would also point out, by the way, that if one looks at this text carefully, and given the constraints of time, we won't look at every text in great detail. That's why, you know, perhaps tomorrow we could do some of that as well. But notice that there is kind of a progression in a negative direction, from ani to, at the end, the mach, who is almost like the threshold. One almost sees in the list of terms, the way the rabbis have arranged the terms, sort of how a person can decline from a sort of dignified sense of self to sort of being like this lowest threshold. We move then to another definition of poverty. This one, the second source here, a more legal definition. And I bring this in. I mean, this is interesting in a religious legal system where one has to have definitions. So what are the poor? And here, this is a text, we're going back now to the 3rd century in the Mishnah. One who possesses 200 zuz may not take. And then we get these 4, the agricultural gifts to the poor that are prescribed in the Hebrew Bible: gleanings, the forgotten sheaf, paya being the corner of the field or the poor man's tithe. So in other words, there's your threshold. If you have 200 zuz, nobody could call you rich, but it's enough that you won't be getting communal assistance. If you possess, okay, we'll skip over the 200 minus 1 dinar. I want to jump to the next paragraph 9. One who has 50 and is using them for his business, he must not take. So in other words, in the first paragraph, if you have 200 and that's what you have in the bank, that's one thing. If you have 50, but you're entrepreneurial, you're able to work with that money and make something of it, then you can't take. This measure doesn't, in my read of it, have much of an afterlife. It contemplates a certain type of charity structure. Professor Gardner has written about this in his first book, The Origins of Organized Charity, and it doesn't necessarily have an afterlife in later rabbinic literature or in the Babylonian Talmud, but it is an interesting effort to put a monetary definition on poverty. A third aspect of looking at this question of who are the poor, or what I call the formerly wealthy poor. These are the shamefaced poor. Michel Molat called them the conjunctural poor. These are people who have fallen from wealth into poverty, and one sees 2 terms for them in rabbinic literature of the 4th and 5th centuries, and then later in the Babylonian Talmud, either the poor of good family or some variation of a person lost their possessions. Literally, they descended from their possessions. The different terms may have once referred to the reality of different types of people, but they're treated pretty much together. Early rabbinic sources, meaning sources of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, are okay with the idea that if a person who was wealthy became poor, you have to support them in the manner to which they were accustomed. And this relates again to what Professor Gardner said yesterday, that these rabbis of the early literature are themselves wealthy. This is not a problem. It becomes a problem later. In the Jerusalem Talmud of the 4th and 5th century, and in the Babylonian Talmud especially, one discerns an ambivalence about doing that. And I'll turn us quickly to the 3rd source, which is on the page labeled page 2. Your photocopy is, of course, double-sided. From Babylonian Talmud B, Ketubot 67b, I'm just going to direct us to the significant parts of the text. A certain person who is one of these formerly wealthy poor comes to Rava, a leading rabbi. Rava says to him, "What do you eat?" And he basically says, "A fattened hen and aged wine." In other words, I eat well. I'm used to things here. And Rava says to him, "Are you not concerned about being a burden to the community?" This is the voice of ambivalence. You don't see this in the 2nd and 3rd century. Rava now, who lives in the 4th century in Babylonia, "Are you concerned about the burden on the community?" And the person answers him with rabbinic interpretation in a rather high-handed way. I'm not eating of the community, I'm eating from God, because we learn in Psalms that God provides. You know, it's like the community is just a conduit, is just a pass-through. I'm eating from what is God's. Rava's not happy about it. The story ends that Rava experiences an interesting coincidence. His sister, whom he hadn't seen for 13 years, then shows up with a fattened hen and aged wine. So he takes this as a sign from God. Ne'eneti lach, he says to the man, I give in to you, I yield to you. come and eat. But the point is, we see this ambivalence. It may be the right thing to do, but we're now worried about the burden on the community. The fourth category of who are the poor is something else that I discern in the Babylonian Talmud, which is a distinction between the laboring poor and those that are not portrayed as working. And the Babylonian Talmud has a notable preference for the laboring poor. Two examples, as I put it here, of BT's ambivalence or neutral to negative portrayals of poor not working come, the first one from Babylonian Talmud Kiddushin 81a to B, which if you read through it, the story reads like a farce. Basically, this gentleman, Polemo, brings a poor person into his home who behaves disgracefully. The person appears to be ungrateful, he is sloppy at the table, he eventually causes a lot of trouble. If we then look at the next text, B Bava Kama 92a to B, we meet Rava again from the 4th century, and Rava is exploring the question, from where do we get the homely saying that poverty follows the poor? He says it's a common saying, everybody says it, from where do we derive it? What's the biblical source? And where does Rava derive it? He derives it from the lepers calling out in the book of Leviticus, unclean, unclean. In other words, the poor person, as it were, walks through the street proclaiming their poverty. I bring these two texts just to show you that in these cases, the poor who are not portrayed as working, sort of the generic chronically poor, there's a certain sense of distance in the Babylonian Talmud. Again, there is charity. Charity is an obligation. That is not only the right thing to do, it's the commanded thing to do, but there is a sense of distance from these poor. On the other hand, the poor that are portrayed as working are viewed much more warmly. And there are various examples I don't have here. One is about the iconic sage Hillel. A story is told about him from the 1st century, that as poor as he was, he would work and study. He worked and studied. Another sage was told, don't rely on being a great sage to get support from the community. You should do even degrading manual labor. That is better than getting support from the community. And then there's the source that I brought from Babylonian Talmud, Bava Metzia 83a. Certain porters broke the wine barrel of Rabba Bar Hanan, a rabbi. He seized their cloaks in compensation. They went and told this other rabbi, look what he did. This other rabbi says, give them back their cloaks. Is this the law, he asks? Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Rabba Bar Chana, and then the workers rather then say to Rav, the other rabbi, we're poor, we toiled all day, we're hungry. I mean, hearing the voice of the poor here is very interesting. We have nothing. Rav says, give them their wages. So they broke the other rabbi's barrel of wine. They get their cloaks back, they get their wages. The other rabbi is astonished. Is this the law? Answer, yes, keep the paths of the righteous. So I do discern this distinction, the laboring poor who get this warmer portrayal than the poor who are portrayed as not working. If we move on to the second heading, poverty and gender, I'll just say something about women's interactions with the poor. There's also the question of how poor women are portrayed. That I don't have quite enough to say right at this moment. But women's interactions with the poor are interesting because women are not portrayed as giving money charity. And that's a whole legal area by itself. How much money, especially married women, how much marital property they're entitled to give away. Rather, women are portrayed as interacting warmly with the poor to whom they give food. And there is a list of sources I have which will make their way into the written paper. That's the dominant portrayal of women and how they act. The poor at the door, as I call them. They are constantly giving food to the poor. And the noted scholar of the medieval Mediterranean, S.D. Goitein, in his multi-volume work, A Mediterranean Society, noted that that pattern persisted, that he saw that in materials from the Cairo Geniza. So this pattern that we see largely in the Babylonian Talmud persists at a later time. If we move on to section 3, the lives of the poor, I mean, here we get a litany of woe. The first, poverty as physically disfiguring or debilitating. I'll turn your attention on page 3 of the sources under the lives of the poor to Mishnah Nidarim 9:10, which Professor Gardner had mentioned yesterday. Here, of course, the poignant line is when Rabbi Ishmael weeps, and he says, the daughters of Israel are beautiful, but poverty makes them ugly. Poverty disfigures them. Poverty, and of course we can imagine why, malnutrition, etc., makes them ugly. There is also a poignant source under this, Genesis Rabbah 33:1. This is a work which is a collection of rabbinic interpretations of the book of Genesis dating to the 4th and 5th centuries. This reminds one of the dach and the mach from the very first source, the people who are so poor that they almost can't move, that they become like the floor, the threshold. Now, Rabbi Joshua ben Levi goes to Rome, and then, of course, note this contrast. He sees they take care of the marble pillars. They wrap them in tapestries so that they don't crack in the winter or in the summer, but then he sees the poor person. The pillars are vertical, the poor person is horizontal. He sees the miskain wrapped up in a mat, and he says, he quotes the two halves of Psalms 36:7 about the pillars. He says, your righteousness is like the mighty mountains. He says, God, when you give abundantly. And then he says over the poor person, where you smite with force. Now, naturally, this has implications for what Rabbi Joshua thinks about the causes of poverty, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. But my point here right now is the portrayal of the poor man as so poor, and the rabbi looking in some sense for a theological explanation of it. There's also, of course, the element of hunger, and I'll just call attention to the source I pointed to a moment ago where the porters call attention to their hunger. There is the element also, the rabbis note, of shame and social exclusion. In the Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, people are described as ignoring their poor relatives, being ashamed of their poor relatives, but God does not. God calls poor people my brothers and my friends, citing the Psalms. There's also a very insightful passage in Leviticus Rabbah, again from the 4th to 5th century, that portrays how the rabbis saw the wealthy ridiculing the poor. How is it that you want my support? Look at those legs, look at those thighs, look at that you're able to work, why don't you work? And again, the point of the rabbinic work is this is, of course, completely unacceptable. God says, how can you ridicule that which I gave this person? I made this person, how can you do this? You must give. Another aspect of the lives of the poor is a frank representation by the rabbis of the poor's anger over their lot. The poor are not necessarily portrayed as being, fine with the way they live. Again, we're back to Leviticus Rabbah in the 4th to 5th century, where a poor person is portrayed as saying, what is the difference between me and so-and-so? Why does so-and-so live in a house and I live outside? Why does so-and-so have a bed and I sleep on the ground? And then there's one that from Professor Mittelmeyer, I was stunned. It resonated so much with this text I'm about to talk about. Debilitating psychological distress. The hadith that poverty leads to disbelief. There is a text, and now I regret I left it off the sheet, from the Babylonian Talmud that mentions that something called dikdukei aniyut, the fine points of poverty, the real harsh poverty can cause a person to lose their sense of self and to lose their sense of their creator. In other words, to completely sort of go beyond their sense of themselves as human and as a believer in God. And then finally, there are what I call ethnographic observations by the rabbis on the daily lives of the poor, which again show a certain distance. And I do believe that particularly in Babylonia, the rabbis are constructing themselves as a middle group between the wealthy on the one hand and the poor on the other, and they observe the poor. They are not of the poor, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes, but the poor eats bread made of unsifted dough. The poor their bread includes the husk of the wheat. The poor wear certain clothes, the rich wear other clothes. The poor dig holes to hide their treasures. The poor who drink only water may get sick. Why? Because poverty follows the poor, that expression that I referred to before. If we move on now to the fourth heading, why is there poverty? Why are poor people poor? Here we get on page 4, there is this interesting text, again from Leviticus Rabbah, about the poverty being a galgal, playing on the biblical word biglal. It's in a fanciful etymology. It is a cycle, a galgal, a wheel that recurs in the world. In other words, it hits everybody sooner or later. It hits everybody. Is this the only view? By no means. There are other texts that point to specific sins that may cause poverty. Those specific sins, those texts may be ways of criticizing certain behaviors. So if you engage in that behavior, you'll get poor. Here we have the notion it hits everyone sooner or later. The next source I have here on this page, page 4, bring home the wretched poor from Isaiah 58:7. Well, what caused these people to become impoverished? Answer, they didn't do charity. They did not extend their hands to the poor. Here, the reference to charity is extending their hands in mitzvot, in the doing of the commandments. The word used here is not tzedakah, but in other words, it's kind of a measure for measure justice. They did not do charity, therefore they lost their wealth. They did not fulfill the will of their Father in heaven. And again, I go back to that text about Rabbi Joshua in Rome with the pillars, where there's an obvious implication when he says about the poor person, God, the one you smite very hard. There is an implication that that person got to their state through some fault of his own. So again, unsurprisingly, there are a range of views, but there is no unequivocal view that poverty is due definitely to sin. There is another element that I'm just going to touch on very lightly right now, which is what I call ideological poverty. And here you do have, there is an interesting text that I did not bring here from Leviticus Rabbah, which talks about Rabbi Yochanan, who's a major figure of the 3rd century, who impoverishes himself in order to study Torah. And the text is ambivalent about his doing so. He describes to his companion, they're taking a walk, I used to own this field, I used to own this, and his companion bursts into tears. And the implication is that, Rabbi Yochanan thinks he did a good thing. He impoverished himself, but yet his companion doesn't think he did a good thing. This is a segue for me to point out that for the rabbis of Roman Palestine, they are not unwilling to embrace poverty to some extent, and I'm talking really about the rabbis of the 4th and 5th century, not the 2nd and 3rd. They are willing to see themselves as poor. To some extent, I think it's an ideological thing. I don't think they really necessarily are always poor, but they don't run away from that as an identification. The rabbis of Babylonia, on the other hand, no way. No way. They do not want to see themselves as poor. They do not describe themselves as poor to the extent that you have rabbis in Babylonia that may have difficult circumstances. They describe that using euphemisms. They do not use the word ani, poor, to describe that. They'll say, they were pressed, dechika le milta. They were very pressed, or dechika le milta tuva. They were extremely pressed, but they won't say that they were poor. So there's a key ideological difference there. Apropos the Babylonian Talmud, they're willing to admit that, you know what, luck plays a role. Rava, whom we've already met, a major scholar of the 4th century, says that sustenance, food, depends on mazal. It depends on astrological determinism. He doesn't attribute it to behavior or something else. In fact, he himself is described elsewhere as having become impoverished because the rabbis, the rest of his colleagues, were displeased with him and he lost his wealth. Rabbi Yochanan in the Babylonian Talmud, in an echo of his self-impoverishment, he overhears an angelic conversation, and he understands from that angelic conversation that he is destined to be poor but a great scholar. That's what he understands. There's something that's kind of fated. What I do want to look at very briefly right now, just we'll be in and out, is this next text on page 4, Bava Batra 10a, on which I've spent many, many hours of my life, which deals with a lot of these questions. In paragraph 1 and 2, the question is, if your God loves the poor, why doesn't he provide for them? The answer put in the mouth of the great Rabbi Akiba is, in order that we might be saved through them from the judgment of Gehinnom, from the judgment of hell. The poor are heroes. The poor are there for redemptive almsgiving, for salvation. That's why God may love the poor, but that's why God doesn't provide for the poor. So we can do it and get salvation. Paragraph 3, the Roman Emperor Turnus Rufus says this is ridiculous. In effect, poverty is a punishment. Rabbi Akiva comes back at him and says, well, it might be a punishment, but it's a fatherly punishment, not a royal punishment. A father doesn't really want to punish. A father can be induced to show mercy. Turnus Rufus, in paragraph 6 on page 5, sort of looks for a way to walk down the middle of that one. Ultimately, my point is, in paragraph 7, the text ends on a very interesting note. It has problematized the notion that poverty is a punishment. It's not clear by the end of the text that that's true. It's problematized redemptive almsgiving. It's not clear that that's effective. So in other words, the Babylonian Talmud, again, is just indicating, I know these ideas are out there, I'm thinking about them, but at the end of the day, I'm not necessarily going to hold these up as the reason that there is poverty. And in fact, while I'm on that subject, before we move on to theological constructions, which flows directly from this, when I mentioned a few minutes ago that the Babylonian rabbis don't want to see themselves as poor, in fact, they do the opposite. There are portrayals in the Babylonian Talmud of rabbis rising from poverty to wealth in tandem with their becoming recognized as great scholars. So they attain Torah wisdom and they become wealthy. The two things go together. But back to theological constructions of the poor, it actually begins in the book of Daniel, which you can see on page 5. Redeem your sins by beneficence, he says, in good biblical Aramaic, and your iniquities by generosity to the poor. Then your serenity may be extended. What's interesting is that the rabbis, though, don't do too much with Daniel 4:24, but they know a great deal about redemptive almsgiving. And the same word root, which yields zakat in Arabic, shows up in the literature of Roman Palestine. In Leviticus Rabbah, there's a rabbi who says, this is the way people talk. The poor will say, is dakei bi. It's the same root. Be merited through me. In other words, give me charity. Zechi bi. Again, be merited through me. Zechi garmach bi. Merit yourself through me, meaning give me charity. The idea is there that the poor person does more for the rich than the rich does for the poor, because the poor provides a way to expiate sin. This all appears very nicely in the next source on page 5 from the Jerusalem Talmud in Tractate Shabbat about the two disciples of Rabbi Hanina, who an astrologer deems they are fated to die by snakebite. However, they run into an old man who says, I've gone 3 days without tasting any food. They had a small amount of food, which they give him half. he blesses them. May you live out this day just as you have helped me. So they go about their business. They come home. The astrologer is astonished. What happened? They tell him what happened. And then, of course, he says, what can I do with my astrology when the God of the Jews is appeased by a half circle of figs? In other words, again, this kind of more this worldly redemptive benefit. They were fated to die, but they were saved from their astrologically determined fate by the fact that they did this charity. This, the acceptance of redemptive almsgiving, or the greater receptiveness to redemptive almsgiving in Roman Palestine, goes together, in my view, with a positive portrayal we see of the poor in the 4th to 5th century literature of Roman Palestine, and some of that can make its way into the written paper. We don't have to deal with it now, but I do want to underline the fact that the Babylonian Talmud in the 7th century is ambivalent. They are ambivalent about redemptive almsgiving. They're ambivalent about the poor's theological role. And in fact, going back to Daniel 4:24, the one place that that verse is quoted in the Babylonian Talmud, they say, well, that's the reason Daniel was punished by being thrown into the den of lions, because he never should have given that advice to King Nebuchadnezzar. He shouldn't have told him about that. The text we looked at, the dialogue between Rabbi Akiba and the Roman emperor, as I pointed out on my reading, ends by problematizing redemptive almsgiving and problematizing the position of the poor as redemptive. And then going back to one of the very first texts we looked at, the dialogue between the Rabbi Rava and the poor man, the formerly wealthy poor, who claims that his sustenance comes from God. The community, who cares about the burden on the community? I'm getting it directly from God. And the fact that even though Rava has to yield to him, the text does show that this is a problematic position. So again, it's not that the Babylonian Talmud does away with these ideas, but it problematizes them. It doesn't see these ideas as ideas that it really embraces. And it also, I just want to sort of put a cross on the T here for the idea that the Babylonian Talmud, as I said before, the rabbis put a certain distance between themselves and the poor. They also demonstrate in a number of texts a certain potential for danger in encounters between donors and the poor. Sometimes donors, these stories tell of dangers, not with the women, not with the poor at the door. They're always fine. But the men, with the encounters with the poor, can sometimes encounter danger, which one does not see in the writings of Roman Palestine. Now, as we move into the Middle Ages and early modernity, they, of course, did not read these texts the way contemporary scholars of rabbinic literature read them. They're not reading them source critically. The texts are canonical. If an idea is there, it's there. They may raise the idea to the surface. The ideas may be submerged, but they read they may excavate ideas, but they're reading them in a particular way. So I want to start briefly with Eliezer of Metz, who lives, he's a man of the 12th century, 1115 to 1198. He creates a new category of the poor. He introduces a concept of the deserving poor by formulating a new category called the deliberate sinner, the avaryan b'mezid, who need not be given charity. And I've written about this elsewhere. His innovation echoes contemporaneous canon law developments, as well as ideas current down the road in Regensburg among the Jewish German pietists, where the book Sefer Hasidim is filled with admonitions not to give charity to unworthy recipients. And Eliezer of Metz had some connections to that circle, and we see elements of that there. One that I'll point out from Sefer Hasidim: if faced with the choice between giving to two poor people, one who's righteous and one who's an evildoer, give to the righteous person and the latter can go to hell. That's literally what it says. The latter can yelech legehinom, go to hell. This is not something one sees in classical rabbinic literature. It's in the pietist circle. Eliezer of Metz brings it up. I bring it up because Eliezer of Metz's innovation passes into the major law books of the 14th century and ultimately into Joseph Caro's Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century. Maimonides is interesting. We probably have to dance somewhat lightly over Maimonides. There are two aspects of his portrayal of poverty and the poor in his law book, Mishneh Torah, that deserve attention. One, his muting of redemptive almsgiving. He does not like redemptive almsgiving at all. He mutes it, he marginalizes it completely, and he has a notable warmth and sympathy for the poor. And here, if you look quickly at the source at the bottom of page 5, in Laws of Things Forbidden for the Altar, he talks about, and this is in the context of his referring to laws related to the Jerusalem temple. He says, of all things were valid for meal offerings, why did the sages rank their quality? Okay, that's fine. And then he says at the top of page 6, because of course there is no temple, there hasn't been a temple since the year 70. The same principle, he says, applies to everything which is done for the sake of the good God. If you feed the hungry, it should be from the best. If you clothe the naked, it should be from the finest. This is his innovation. It is not something he's recycling from earlier literature. This is his innovation. So this is an example of how with even not just classical rabbinic literature, but medieval and early modern literature, one has to be source critical, to look for the innovation by comparing what someone inherited versus what they ultimately produce. He also does this in an original way in Laws of the Esther Scroll and Hanukkah, chapter 2, paragraph 17, where he makes the point that one should enjoy the Purim festival more by gladdening the hearts of the poor, orphans, widows, and strangers than oneself. Again, that idea, it's not that the rabbis of the Talmud would object to that idea, but it's just not there. He himself makes that point. Instead of spending more on your own friends, on your own Purim festive meal, spend more on the poor. Maimonides, as I said, he also focuses on the poor's own obligations, which also echoes something from Professor Mittelmeier's presentation. He points out in the Laws of Character Traits, he says, fools marry before ensuring they are materially prepared to start a family, meaning they will need charitable support. Famously in Laws of Gifts to the Poor 10.7, which you have on page 6, the highest degree of almsgiving, of course, is giving someone a job or a loan or a business opportunity so that, in fact, they do not need charity. Laws of Gifts to the Poor 10.19 on page 6. Whoever needs alms but denies himself, in other words, it's not that one doesn't take when one really needs to take, but you could live in a more austere way and just try to do without. He says that person will not die of old age until he shall have provided maintenance for others out of his own wealth. And putting together Laws of Gifts to the Poor 10.7 with 10.19, you see that for Maimonides, accepting alms is not really the ideal. The ideal is to be in a situation where one is capable of self-sufficiency. And with that, I mean, he does hearken back to passages like the latter part of the second source in these handouts, Mishnah Peah 8:8-9, as well as the story of Rava and the formerly wealthy poor man. It's better not to be taking. Of course, take if you need to take, but it's better if you do not have to take. The poor have certain obligations. If we jump then from the 12th century to the 16th century, here Joseph Caro, 1488 to 1575, echoes Yusuf al-Qaradawi when he makes the point here in the beginning of his law book, Beit Yosef, House of Joseph, quoting an earlier text. He says, for peace will come on account of gemilut chasadim, reciprocal acts of kindness. Were it not for those, the poor would commit robbery. And again, a very realistic, not at all romantic view of the poor, and a sense that doing this good is important for social peace, that recognition about the need for social peace. In his law book, Shulchan Aruch, I actually have researched his view of poverty and the poor throughout the law book. Caro, similar to Maimonides in the 12th century, who has not been studied closely yet, Caro makes legal determinations when faced with a choice between alternatives based on his prior sources. He will choose the alternative that favors the poor. And when he doesn't, there's a good reason for it. There's a good reason for it, but he tends to do that. Two examples that I'll just talk about quickly. One is he rewrites Maimonides' famous 8 levels of charity, of which Laws of Gifts to the Poor 10.7 is one. He rewrites them subtly to put someone else at the top of the list. To Joseph Caro, providing a dowry for a poor orphan girl is the highest form of charity. So he'll put her there as opposed to Maimonides, who's clearly talking about a householder. Another example with Caro, which is very interesting, is he makes the point based upon a 13th century law book, a case which is described there, that creditors cannot demand debt repayment from charity. So if a poor person collects a certain amount of charity, it's enough to support their family, a creditor cannot come in and seize that as charity. And again, he plucks this ruling out of the midst of a very long discussion of charity law found in a 13th century law book from Vienna, actually, the Or Zarua by Isaac of Vienna. And again, he uses this, and in other such determinations, he rewrites his source material in order to introduce these laws that, when you look at them all together, paint a picture of a legal system which, to the extent it's possible, again, if it's not possible, there's a good reason, but to the extent it's possible, are for the benefit of the poor. If we stay a little later in the 16th century, and then get into the 17th century, we return to Prague, or go to Prague, with this gentleman named Shlomo Ephraim Lundschitz, 1551 to 1619. He's known for his sermons and homilies, as well as a Bible commentary, which is called in Hebrew, Kli Yakar, the precious vessel. And what's interesting about the precious vessel is, as I said at the very beginning, he is obsessed with wealth and poverty. The historian Menachem ben Sasson has written about this, even though more remains to be done. And it does, of course, have something to do, this already being early modernity, there's more context, we know a bit more about what's going on in this time and place, and Lundschitz spares no words in harshness towards the rich, but he also has some words about the poor. And what always kind of even almost amused me was how he would take verses that seemed to have nothing to do with wealth and poverty and use it as an opportunity. On Exodus 22:24, which is not something you have on the handout, this is the verse in which God says, when you should lend to my people, make loans to my people. The verse has God referring to God's people. Lundschitz explains why the text says my people. Why does Scripture say that? And he says, because basically it's the king's job to provide for his kingdom. God is the king. So to the extent that one helps out the king by providing for the people, you have done it for the king. So he's echoing this idea that we see as well as I've learned now in Islam and elsewhere, that you're sort of lending, you're giving to God. And Lundschitz also brings up the dialogue between Rabbi Akiba and the Roman general. He is not reading it in a source-critical way. He reads it for its redemptive almsgiving. And he says on Exodus 22:24, giving to the poor, even lending to the poor, this, as the Talmud says, is going to lead to your salvation. He's not reading the ambivalence. He's reading the text straightforwardly, and that's what he sees. And then finally, we have Kli Yakar to Exodus 23:5, which you have here. The verse, Exodus 23:5, when you see the ass of your enemy lying under its burden and would refrain from raising it, you must nevertheless raise it with him. In other words, you cannot hold a grudge. Just your enemy is having a difficult time. You can't rejoice in that and walk away. You must help your enemy. And he makes the comment, from here we learn a response to the few poor of our people who impose themselves upon the public and refuse to do any work. I mean, as if that has anything really to do with the verse. Even if they have the ability to work or to engage in some other activity, they complain if they're not given enough. And he says, this God does not demand supporting the poor unless the poor person puts in an effort. And he says, we get that from the phrase in the verse, raise it with him. In other words, you raise the poor person with the poor person. That's what it is. The poor person has to help. The poor person must do everything within his power to help himself. If after that he can't afford to live in a dignified manner, then everyone is required to support him, to encourage him, but otherwise he has to help himself. So just in terms of thinking about Lunchitz, even in the midst of a commentary in which most of his criticism is directed at the rich, here he does recognize that, again, not all the poor necessarily are poverty doesn't necessarily go together with inherent goodness. In fact, the poor have a duty to help themselves, and they have to do so in order to justify the community's support. So this sort of a broad topical overview, again, from the 4th, 5th century through the 16th century. And I look forward to the discussion and to especially to aspects of the discussion that enable me to bring out things that I was only able to touch on briefly.